My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to talk about Episcopal succession and see what the earliest evidence seems to say about it, whether it supports a threefold office with bishop at the top, presbyter, and deacon underneath, or whether it maybe supports more of a presbyterial model with a college of presbyters and deacons underneath them. Alright, so first up, let's elaborate on what episcopal succession kind of means. So, first you have the threefold office, bishop, presbyter, deacon. I mentioned that earlier. Bishops on top, they have the highest authority. They're the only ones that can validly ordain. And then it teaches that you have an unbroken chain of succession of bishops from the time of the apostles all the way up to modern churches now, whichever church you happen to be a part of, Catholic or Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox, whichever one you happen to think is the one true church. And then also ties sacramental efficacy to this valid succession. If you are not validly ordained through a valid bishop that has apostolic succession, then you cannot consecrate the Eucharist or give any valid sacraments at all. Okay, so that's just the general idea. Let's get into what the Apostolic Fathers say. Now, Clement of Rome is writing approximately around 90 AD. The dates are, they're approximate. The dates can be disputed, and I'm just kind of putting a date somewhere in the middle. But he says, our apostles also knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be strife on account of the office of the episcopate. For this reason, therefore, inasmuch as they had obtained a perfect foreknowledge of this, they appointed those ministers already mentioned, and afterwards gave instructions that, when those should fall asleep, other approved men should succeed them in their ministry. We are of opinion, therefore, that those appointed by them or afterwards by other eminent men, with the consent of the whole church, and who have blamelessly served the flock of Christ in a humble, peaceable, and disinterested spirit, and have for a long time possessed the good opinion of all, cannot be justly dismissed from the ministry. For our sin will not be small if we eject from the episcopate those who have blamelessly and holily fulfilled its duties. Blessed are those presbyters who, having finished their course before now, have obtained a fruitful and perfect departure from this world. Alright, so he's talking about the office of the episcopate. And if the threefold office is in effect at the time Clement is writing this, then he should not say this. He should be talking of the office of the episcopate in reference to the bishops, because that's what the office of the episcopate is the bishops. But he says the presbyters. Blessed are those presbyters. Again, in the second quote, he says, who then among you is noble-minded, who compassionate, who full of love? Let him declare if, on my account, sedition and disagreement and schisms have arisen. I will depart, I will go away, wherever ye desire, and I will do whatever the majority commands. Only let the flock of Christ, that is the church, live on terms of peace with the presbyters set over it. Once again, who is set over the church? Who has authority over the church? He says the presbyters are set over the church. But once again, if the threefold office of bishop, presbyter, and deacon was a thing in the time that Clement is writing this, it doesn't really make sense for him to say this. He seems to be confusing the office of bishop and presbyter, despite the fact that at this time he is allegedly supposed to be the bishop of Rome. So that's just a very strange thing for him to confuse. And then the last quote, and thus preaching through countries and cities, that is, he's talking about the apostles preaching through countries and cities, they appointed the first fruits of their labors, having first proved them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons of those who should afterwards believe. Nor was this any new thing, since indeed many ages before it was written concerning bishops and deacons. So once again, we have another anomalous piece of data in his writing. He says that the apostles appointed bishops and deacons. He only mentions two offices, but obviously they would have appointed not just bishops and deacons, but bishops, deacons, and presbyters. But there's no mention of presbyters when he's saying who the apostles appointed. That's a strange thing to omit when there's a threefold office. So, there's a lot of strange things here. He seems to believe that, if we assume the threefold office isn't existent at the time Clement is writing this, he seems to confuse the fact that presbyters are part of the episcopate when only the bishop should be, and that the presbyters have the authority over it, and also that the apostles only appointed bishops and deacons but not presbyters. That's all very strange, but if we assume that the apostles appointed only presbyters and deacons, and that bishop is a separate title for the same office of presbyter, and that the churches function with a college of presbyters over the deacons and the laity, then suddenly everything that he's saying makes total sense. But if we assume a threefold office, it's confusing. Next, we have the Didache. Now, the Didache, there isn't a whole lot here. This is the only quote that I think deals with what we're talking about here. But it's a very similar quote to the last quote by Clement. Therefore appoint for yourselves bishops and deacons worthy of the Lord, men meek and not lovers of money, and truthful and proven, for they also render to you the service of prophets and teachers. Once again, he's talking to the churches, the author of the Didache, whoever that happens to be, and he tells them to appoint bishops and deacons. It's two offices. But surely the churches would need presbyters as well as bishops and deacons, not just bishops and deacons. Unless, of course, we assume that presbyter and bishop are the same office, and there's no distinction between those two offices at this time period. Once again, we have a very strange omission, which doesn't make sense under the assumption of a threefold office, but does make sense under the assumption of two offices, with bishop being an interchangeable title for presbyter. And lastly, here we have, for the Apostolic Fathers portion of this, we have Ignatius of Antioch. Now, he just was the Bishop of Antioch. Now, I'm not going to dispute that because that's just not historically accurate. And he did advocate submission to bishops in several of his letters. But one letter where he does not really do this, in fact, he doesn't really mention even the title of bishop at all, except for in reference to himself as the Bishop of Antioch. It's the only time he mentions it. He writes a letter to the Roman Church. And if there was a bishop in Rome at the time, a monarchical bishop, and since the Roman Church is supposed to be the most important church at this time period, and so the Roman bishop, the most important bishop, it would seem strange for him to omit any Roman bishop and a call to submission to this most important of bishops, if such a bishop actually existed. But he does not make that information. Now, I'm just going to sort of explain the consensus. So, I've said already, he was the bishop of Antioch. This is a historical fact. But he's considered to be the first in mainstream historical consensus that the bishop, that he was appointed, and that the churches functioned under a Presbyterian model, a college of presbyters, before appointing him as a monarchical bishop. And so, other churches also did this in that region, in general, Syria, southern, modern-day Turkey. These were the first churches to develop a monarchical episcopacy in this region. And that after his death, he wrote a whole lot of letters saying submit to the bishop, that sort of thing, and he was an advocate of this new ecclesiology. So the other churches after his martyrdom tended to adopt his ecclesiology pretty quickly. So sometime in the late 110s or early 120s probably, the monarchical episcopacy that Ignatius advocated for becomes the universal practice in the churches. And that's generally the consensus, and even several Catholic scholars, which I'll get into later, make this same concession. And while I'm on this point, I don't have a separate slide for it, but it's just something that can give us some more context to the New Testament and the time of the apostles. Obviously, the apostles were Jews, so they lived in the first century, and in the first century, the synagogues that the Jews worshipped in the various different cities that had a sizable Jewish population, all really functioned under a college of rabbis, similar to a Presbyterian model. And so this model that the apostles all would have been familiar with, it really does just make sense for them when they're establishing the church to adopt this same model when creating the church. So if we're just going to go, inference to the best explanation, I think it just makes sense, given what Clement says, the Didache, and what's generally considered the consensus on the life of Ignatius, and the context of the Jewish synagogues, their ecclesiology. It does just make sense that the apostles would adopt this model, as opposed to a monarchical episcopacy. And now we'll go ahead and go into some Catholic historians. So here we have Michael Walsh. He wrote a book called The Popes. Here's what he says about the early papacy. And it also sounds as though Clement was writing the letter as a secretary, the letter to the Corinthians that we just read a portion of just a little bit earlier, rather than as the author. The letter was written on behalf of the community in Rome. No bishop is mentioned. It is the Church of Rome which is important, not the Bishop of Rome. Perhaps in the years immediately following Peter's death, there was no single bishop in Rome. It may be that there was a form of government by a group of priests, all of more or less equal status, Linus, Cletus, and Clement. If so, it would explain the confusion of succession lists. And so what he mentions there at the end is various different church fathers, Irenaeus, Eusebius, Augustine, some other, probably, can't name off the top of my head. They have these succession lists that they make for the Bishop of Rome from the time of Peter up to whenever they're writing. And these succession lists do not match up. They contradict each other on various points. Some of them place Linus as the first bishop after Peter. Others place Clement as the first bishop after Peter. And I think some of them also switch up other people as well at various points. And some of them, I think, even might just make up some people that maybe didn't even exist. Like Cletus, for example. I think that Cletus shows up in some, but whether he's a distinct person from another guy called Anacletus, he's sometimes distinct from them, that's not clear. And so there's just a lot of confusion about these succession lists. And so once again, let's just add that piece of information to the list of evidence we have here. So, the apostles, in their historical context, are familiar with the synagogue ecclesial structure, and it would just make logical sense for them to adopt that same structure when forming their churches. The confusion of titles that Clement seems to have, and the fact that the Didache and Clement only seem to mention 2 offices that are ordained, not 3, even though 3 offices are supposed to have existed at this time. And then, on top of that, the fact that Ignatius does not mention a bishop of Rome in his letter to the Romans, and then the later authors, later scholars, creating succession lists that all contradict each other, makes total sense if you assume that there was no episcopal succession, and these later scholars are just constructing a history that didn't actually happen. So all of the pieces of evidence we're working with, that we have available to us, seem very strange if we assume a threefold office at the time of the apostles. A lot of stuff is very anomalous, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but these anomalous pieces of data make a whole lot of sense when you have the assumption that there is a presbyterial model that the apostles create. And that's just the simpler, most straightforward way to read the history. And it's also the historical consensus. And then, also Francis A. Sullivan, From Apostles to Bishops, The Development of the Episcopacy in the Early Church. I mean, he just concedes pretty much exactly that point, that the apostles appointed presbyters and deacons, and that the churches were run by a college of presbyters, and that the churches in southern Turkey and Syria started to appoint monarchical bishops to lead the churches. And I believe he argues that even though this is a historical reality, the development of this episcopacy is was a theological necessity guided by the Holy Spirit, is what he tries to argue. So, that is just kind of the historical consensus of what happened. And Francis A. Sullivan's solution to this, citing development of doctrine in kind of like the vein of John Henry Newman, doesn't really work, and I'll explain why. Okay, so we have a problem, even if we assume development of doctrine in the Newman sort of way, because development of doctrine cannot contradict previous teachings. It can expand upon it, it can clarify it, but it cannot contradict clear teachings that came before it. But the apostles had to have taught that presbyters can ordain other presbyters and deacons, because they couldn't teach anything else, because they had to teach that someone could ordain someone. And bishops didn't exist at the time, unless you want to, again, ignore all of the evidence that we have of the earliest church, and then also in both the New Testament and the Apostolic Fathers, and then the succession list and all that stuff that adds confusion to the matter, and then the historical consensus. I mean, you can do that, but I would say that's just unreasonable. But then, so they couldn't teach that bishops could ordain, because bishops didn't exist, at least as a separate office from presbyter. So they had to teach that presbyters can ordain. So when Paul says in Titus, he says, hold on one moment, Titus 1:5, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." So he's telling Titus to ordain basically other presbyters and deacons. Well, Titus held an office within the church, and so that office was presbyter, as the highest office that you could have, because again, bishop did not exist. So presbyters had to have been able to ordain. They couldn't possibly have taught anything different unless they just taught that no one could ordain anybody, and that just wouldn't make any sense. But then the problem arises when, apostolic churches, or supposedly apostolic churches, that claim to have a unique continuity with the apostles, they teach that presbyters cannot ordain other presbyters and deacons. They don't just teach that bishops are like the primary ordainers. They're the primary office that ordains, and then presbyters can also ordain on top of that, but that is just not proper or something like that. No, they teach that only apostles can ordain. I mean, only bishops can ordain. Now, this is just a direct contradiction to apostolic teaching. You have the apostles teaching A because they couldn't possibly teach anything other than A. Again, unless you just want to ignore the evidence. And then the apostolic churches teach not A. Presbyters cannot ordain other presbyters and deacons. This is just a blatant contradiction of what the apostles taught. And so, if that is the case, Newman's development hypothesis does not get you out of this dilemma. It is really a problem, because you are directly contradicting apostolic teaching. And so your church, whatever your church is, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, they don't differ on this point. Presbyters cannot ordain other presbyters and deacons. They cannot be infallible if they're in contradiction with the apostolic teaching, which they just have to be. So, there you have it. That's simply a problem with the modern teaching of those churches. They cannot possibly claim that they are not in direct contradiction with what the apostles taught. Alright. That is all that I have. Thank you for listening.